Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. It's Friday. We are in simpatico. I mean, this was like psychic energy here.
Yeah, this was not planned, by the way. I don't think we could have planned it any better in terms of the coordination.
Fun Fridays. We've got patterns, we've got energy. But there is some serious news. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, is in danger of being drained of monies to provide relief for victims of hurricanes. Earlier this week, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas told reporters the agency does not have enough funding to last through the hurricane season. Here he is on Air Force One. Let's listen.
We are meeting the immediate needs with the money that we have. We are expecting another hurricane hitting. We do not have the funds. FEMA does not have the funds to make it through the season.
Apart from assessing the damage from Hurricane Helene, the agency is tasked with providing meals, water, generators, and other critical supplies to impacted areas. The catastrophic storm hit Florida last week and pummeled everything in its path as it moved up the southeast coast. As of now, 200 people have been killed and hundreds more are still missing. Moody's Analytics estimates the losses could tally around $34 billion. Congress recently replenished FEMA, injecting $20 billion into its relief fund. This was part of a short-term government bill that funds it through December 20th. According to the AP, a bipartisan group of senators from impacted areas wrote their leadership this week demanding that Congress do more to meet constituents' needs. Meanwhile, Harris, who visited Augusta, Georgia on Wednesday, is getting skewered online over the announcement that victims of the hurricane will receive $750 in relief. Frequent Biden critic Colin Rugg posted on X, quote, Kamala Harris kindly offers $750 to Americans who have lost their homes due to flooding from Hurricane Helene. The development comes as the Biden administration is now bragging about providing 67 Starlink satellites to impacted communities. For reference, the United States has sent well over $100 billion to Ukraine. Another user posted, quote, $175 billion for Ukraine, $150.7 billion for illegal aliens, but $750 for Americans. This is Kamala's America. Americans deserve better. Conversely, former President Trump launched a GoFundMe campaign to raise money for Hurricane Helene victims. So far, it's raised nearly $5 million. Okay, come on now. I mean, as we listed, this was something that was passed in Congress, and over 175 Congress members and senators voted against this bill, and some of the same senators that are in these struck regions are now demanding more money from the administration. But this is not, as we know so well, Congress is the one who has the purse strings. It's not the administration.
Yeah, that's true, but it is problematic that FEMA has apparently not managed its resources well enough in order to get through the hurricane season. I mean, we also know that FEMA has given hundreds of millions of dollars to deal with the migrant crisis, which is an avoidable situation. A natural disaster is not. And even on a statewide basis, we see states like New York City giving $350 a week to families of four who are illegal immigrants, which is about $18,000 a year, as well as free housing in a lot of these cities. And so it's really, I think, hard for people to understand why, as an American citizen, you apparently get less aid than someone who is in the country illegally and has not been paying into the system for however many years. And your house is hit by a hurricane, you have nothing, and you get $750. I mean, even during the pandemic, we were able to give people $1,200 checks twice. Now these people are getting a pittance in comparison.
I agree that we should have given them more money during the pandemic, and given, it's good that they got that money, and that's something that Congress passed because they stepped up. But Congress, unfortunately, there's a group of conservative lawmakers, a large group of conservative lawmakers that just never want to spend money on anything. And when the emergency happens, they point to Democrats and say, and to illegals, quote, illegals, undocumented people. But that's Department of Homeland Security. FEMA, in particular, and I understand that the bill that they passed also covered some other things, but FEMA's funding goes to emergency disasters. And these emergency disasters are happening more and more often. There are more and more earthquakes, there are more and more tornadoes. Climate change is heating up the planet, heating up the waters. Puerto Rico, in particular, there was a report that was listed last week saying that the waters around Puerto Rico are the warmest in the Atlantic, and they're expecting more climate disasters to hit that area in the coming years if nothing is done. So we can't have it both ways. We can't sit here, and I don't think the American people buy it either. It might be nice for a few people on Twitter to sound off and say this is Kamala's America, but I don't think it really clicks for most Americans when you have a senator denying climate change and denying climate change dollars for disaster relief, and then when the day comes that they need that support, they're not there. I mean, I think these are senators who are running scared, Congress members who are running scared now because a lot of them are up for re-election this year, and they want to point to Kamala Harris, who had nothing to do with this.
I think it's a bit of a straw man to say that you can't simultaneously think climate change is happening, but also disagree with the way that certain people want to address that problem. I mean, for example, people might take issue with the idea that you have to pass the Green New Deal in order to properly address climate change, and would say that there's trade-offs to that, right? Because you're putting people out of work, you're also challenging the fact that people get cheap, reliable, and abundant energy from natural resources, fossil fuels, et cetera, and that our infrastructure is not in a place where we can support just powering people's homes with windmills, turbines, whatever, electric vehicles, solar, exactly. So to say that they're climate deniers because they disagree with how to fund the problem, I think is not quite right. And I think people do connect this to the Biden administration because we saw the response from the Biden administration was incredibly slow, where the storm hit over the weekend. Joe Biden was on the beach in Rehoboth through Sunday night. He didn't get back to the White House until late Sunday night. Kamala Harris was doing a fundraiser in Las Vegas, Nevada on Sunday night, didn't get back to the White House until Monday. Neither of them had an in-person briefing about this situation when there was already a 120 plus person death count until Monday afternoon. Trump was already on the ground in Georgia on Monday morning. So
Trump already was planned to be on the ground in Georgia. And, you know, as Biden said, keep in mind, I find it interesting that everybody says he was on the beach when it was raining all weekend. That would have been amazing to see. But phones do work, and they've been briefed. This is how administrations work. There are multiple crises happening at once, and you know, phones do work. An in-person briefing is different than a briefing with your staff. He's also around staff all the time. Does that mean he was in the White House? These are ridiculous distractions from the real issue, which is Congress does not consistently fund FEMA. FEMA needs more funding, especially if we have more natural disasters.
FEMA doesn't need more funding. They just need to get their priorities straight on where they're spending it. They spent billions of dollars addressing the migrant crisis. That's not what FEMA money is supposed to be used for.
That's the Department of Homeland Security.
No,
and
FEMA.
We're muddying the waters here. So, you know, and by the way,
$640 million of FEMA funding allocated for assisting migrants.
For assisting migrants, but this is what I'm trying to say here. Simultaneously, you have the Texas governor who's taking his responsibilities away and sending migrants to New York, right? And making it an emergency.
It's not his responsibility, though, because
He's
he
the
didn't
governor
ask
of
for
Texas.
this. But he's not the one making border policy, and he didn't ask for this. And in fact, when he tried to respond to the migrant crisis by putting more Texas resources at the southern border, he was sued by the Biden administration. So you can't say that our policy is that we're going to make a national policy related to allowing certain migrants to come in and effectively having open borders, and put all of the responsibility for that on one governor in Texas who doesn't want that policy. It's not his responsibility.
Well, he ran for governor of Texas. You're in a border state. You know, I was born in Arizona. If I were to run for office in Arizona, I would understand I'm from Arizona and there's a border there, and I'm going to have to learn how to deal with these issues. And by the way, it's deeply problematic that this governor does not respect the communities. I mean, Texas, first off, Texas was Mexico at one point. You know, that's a whole other conversation.
Indeed.
So if you really want to go back through history, the fact that he is so opposed to having migrants, immigrants, many of whom are legal, and he is more interested in separating families and being a strong man than actually being somebody who understands the history and legacy of his state and the communities who've been there for generations. You know, this is the fabric of America. And I really can't get over the fact that the Republican Party has become so ethnocentric that this is a racial issue. It is not a financial issue.
Why is it a racial issue? Because you don't want people to go across the border illegally. That's a racial issue.
But what is illegally in your terms? These are migrants and people are escaping.
It means not doing it through the legal process. Yes, and there's an asylum process for that. And they're not.
Going through
no, they have not.
This
no, they have not.
This is the dispute that's crazy. They're sitting at the border waiting because our courts are backed up, we don't have enough offices open, because our previous administration refused to deal with the foreign policy that led to a lot of these crises. He mocked the countries in South America and Mexico, had poor relationships with their leaders. This is not just about there are people coming over the border. There are crises in these communities in Honduras and in Guatemala.
There's a
now.
crisis in North Carolina right now. We have a responsibility to take care of our citizens before we start offloading billions of dollars to people who don't respect our laws and our sovereignty.
So this is what I love about the Republican argument here. They're like, well, first we have to deal with immigrants, and then we'll deal with that. But we don't want to fund FEMA to deal with our people who in America who are hit by crises because FEMA's funding the immigrants. But we want to deal with both of these issues, but we're not actually dealing with any of them. How about we fund both? Is that a problem? Why can't we just fund our programs? Republicans don't want to fund anything. They just want to give tax breaks to billionaires and then point in everybody else's direction when the problem hits home.
Well, the problem is that, first of all, you can't just fund everything because there's a such thing called national debt, which hurts the economy when it's too high, okay? So unlimited spending, we already know, leads to inflation. MIT Sloan and Johns Hopkins University both did studies indicating that about half of the current inflation hike for over the past 4 years during the Biden administration was caused by the passage of the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's not just throw more money at the problem, and they're not saying that they want to give money to migrants because they've come across the border illegally and they get free shelter and they get debit cards and they get EBT and food stamps. They want border security. That's a different policy question, not a money question.
Have you been to the border?
I've not.
So if you go to the border, it is incredibly clear. Within miles of reaching the border, within 45 miles of the border in Arizona, Nogales, you're stopped by Homeland Security, who will often check your car, check the trucks, and then as you get closer to the border, they're monitoring, and in the line they monitor you. It is impossible to penetrate that border. So when I hear the stories about how people are crossing, yes, there are some spaces in the middle of the desert.
There's been 1 million gotaways over the past 4 years.
That number has proven false, by the way.
No, it's actually
it's
a minimum of 1 million. It's actually probably higher than that. And then we also know 5 million who have been processed and then released into the interior of the United States. This is the problem because they say that they want more resources for the border, but they don't want to change the policy. So if you add more Border Patrol agents, but you're still simply processing migrants and then allowing them into the interior of the United States, you still have a catch and release policy. They're still in the country illegally. And unfortunately, we have no system right now to track these people once they get into the interior of the country. For example, the CBP One app, you actually are not allowed—
Which is Donald Trump's app, by the way.
You're not allowed through DHS to actually track migrants through that app. It's a voluntary check-in process. And if the migrant chooses
civil liberties, that's number one.
I don't care. They're not here legally, so you should be able to track them.
You still have civil liberties.
They're going through a court process. It's the same as if you were serving a warrant to somebody, if you were picking somebody up who has been accused of a crime and hasn't shown up for court. But for some reason, when they're here illegally, we're not allowed to do that because it violates their civil liberties.
But Amber, I just have a question. This is all great. We wanted to pass a bipartisan Border Security Act, and Congress didn't pass it because Republicans refused.
That's not
like
why.
Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz didn't pass it. He doesn't want to fund FEMA for natural disasters. He doesn't want to fund the solution for our border security crisis, which I don't even think is a crisis. Nobody in the Republican Party wants to fund anything, and yet all they do is complain about these problems, and when it's election time, they start pointing to the administration, they start pointing to everybody else but themselves, because at the end of the day, they're more interested in the big tax breaks for billionaires and distracting everybody else from the problems that we're facing in this country. I mean, that's just the truth of it. Look at the donors to Ted Cruz. Look at his donors. He has no interest in border security. He has no interest in subsidizing, natural disaster relief funding. He has no interest in any of this.
I find it to be such an overgeneralization to say repeatedly that Republicans don't want to fund FEMA. They disagree with where the money that they're giving to them is going. That's a separate policy conversation. Nobody's saying that. Who is arguing that we don't want to fund FEMA?
175 senators and Congress members, Republicans, decided not to fund it in March. It's still passed, thank God, but they're the ones who don't want to fund it.
They decided not to fund it, or did they have an issue with the way the bill was written because they didn't want the money going to certain programs within FEMA, such as migrant relief?
Well, when I read it in the AP, they didn't say that, and they haven't proposed another bill. So if they're not funding it, they're against it at this point. And tell that to all the people whose houses just got blown away.
Yeah, I agree. You should tell them that we just spent half of this segment arguing about immigration because apparently we have to defend sending $1 billion to migrants and giving them free EBT cards than just agreeing on the fact that $750 for the families who have been affected by this is absurd.
Crises are crises, and we need to deal with crises. It doesn't mean that you cut off the funding because you don't get what you want. And that's holding the government hostage for your own interests.
Okay, we'll agree to disagree. We have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising right after this.